So welcome everyone on this Thursday evening, January 23rd, 2025. Scott gave a very moving post-inauguration talk last night for Wisdom Wednesday. He picked up the theme of Everyday Zen, the theme for our upcoming 30 Days of Zen, starting with the simplicity of our everyday practice. As Scott put it, practicing for the world, as the world, and in the world. Nothing special. At the same time, living by vow. David Brazier, the author of the book that the book group is reading right now, is The Feeling Buddha. Brazier calls it a primal vow, a vow that underpins an instinctive way of living in the world, living the Eightfold Path, such that distressing circumstances can thereby bring out the best in us. Paraphrasing Brazier, Scott said, "Inspiration needs expression, just as inhalation needs exhalation." Practice in action. If you missed last night, check out the recording. The Dylan lyrics, which Scott practically sang, resound with our time. This past Monday, while the inauguration played out, I took some time to reread Martin Luther King Jr., excerpts from his letters and speeches. So here's a passage from King's 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Kind of near to Zen. Sounds like the Bodhisattva vow, the deep recognition that my awakening depends on the awakening of all. So reading Martin Luther King while the new administration was assuming power, I came across a post by Shorin Heather. She's a Zen priest who lives and writes from Tassajara. She called it, the post, "Don't Despair About Despair, a dispatch from the monastery." They were 2 weeks into their winter ongo, their 3-month intensive practice period. And she wrote, "Most mornings I spend close to 4 hours sitting silently on a black cushion and staring at a white wall. Although my body is still, my mind flits hither and thither. A wandering mind is a suffering one. And during these 2 weeks, many moments of despair have agitated my wandering mind and stationary body. Of course, there's much to despair about. However, when I believe the veracity of dismaying thoughts, the despair intensifies and reifies itself. The projections spin, spiral, and swirl. Allowing my mind to run amok reinforces the tendency of mind to proliferate and proliferate until there's too many obstructions to see reality as it is. I become trapped behind a wall of conceptualization. The practice of Zen, she goes on, is to be with and breathe through distressing emotional sensations or heavy-handed thoughts without identifying with them, without buying into their narratives, without making concrete conclusions. To be with whatever arises as fully as we are able. Just a bit later, she wrote, to remind myself that every single person suffers, that the MAGA supporters are not the other, are not my enemy. Their suffering is my suffering. Their liberation is my liberation. Then she goes on to talk about vow. Her post is interspersed with quotes from Martin Luther King. And then she ends finally with a simpler vow. Today, instead of bending the knee to despair, I will sit upright and breathe in the despair and suffering, and breathe out Dr. King's legacy of love, justice, and peace for all beings. Then this last quote from MLK. I still believe that love is the most durable power in the world. Love with no opposite. Don't despair about despair. The title brings to mind the Buddhist parable of the second arrow, a parable about the nature of suffering and how to deal with it more skillfully. The Buddha is said to have once asked a student, if a person is struck by an arrow, is it painful? If the person is struck by a second arrow, is it even more painful? He then went on to explain, in life, we can't always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. The second arrow is optional. Such a down-to-earth teaching. A student here at Mountain Cloud recently shared the kind of shift that can happen when this instruction is experienced in the context of practice. This student is a therapist who likes to draw cartoons. And recently he sent one. We had met and shared this experience, and then he said, oh, I drew a cartoon, like I do from time to time. Oh, send it to me. It's 4 frames. In the first frame, he's coaching a client on the wisdom of the Buddha's second arrow teaching. There's a picture of this client with 2 arrows looking distraught. In the next frame, there's some text. He writes, not even a day later, I was sitting in a meditation retreat obsessing about one of my second arrows, my own reaction to being hurt. And the image is a cartoon figure of the student sitting on a cushion, arms in the air with 2 arrows. The third frame. I sat long enough that the bottom fell out. There was a shift from it being my hurt to the pain of the world, universal hurt. There's a caption below next to the figure, in this frame, the figure of the Buddha. And the little balloon says, "That's the first noble truth, dumbass." And then in the final frame, the figure has changed to a person, cartoon person, with a heart-shaped torso, broken down the middle, an arrow. And the caption reads, "I sat on my cushion, trying to expand and hold it all, support it all." The broken heart figure has this little balloon that says, "Nobody is immune." What happens when we stop and see my pain and the pain of the whole world aren't separate? What dissolves? At our Zazen Kai last Saturday, I talked about Pang Ling Zhao and her father, the famous 8th century lay practitioner known as layman Pang. Ling Zhao, this rather remarkable daughter, was born in the last year of the An Lushan Rebellion, a time of suffering and despair throughout the land. As I said Saturday, in a span of a single decade, a decade of civil war, famine, and disease, 2 out of 3 people died. It's a large population. 2 out of 3. An iconic time. Not in the sense of outmeasuring the pain and loss of other disasters. Gaza, Ukraine, the fires in LA, and so on. But iconic as in one body of suffering. That period in China gave rise to 2 Chan masters whose teaching forms the root of all the Zen schools that follow, the lineages down to this day, down to us, these ancestors. Layman Pang studied with both of these masters. Interesting, they didn't know each other, these 2, but they had an incredible affinity. They are Shitou, or Sekito, and Mazu, or Baso. I touched on them, these 2, on Saturday, and they hung around, so just want to continue that thread a bit. So strong and clear the teachings, and no trace of despair about despair. Some time ago, some years ago actually now, Joan Sutherland wrote a piece for Lion's Roar about these 2 masters. It's titled Koans for Troubled Times. Sutherland begins with the urgency of the world situation. She names it unending conflict, environmental disaster, the starvation of millions. This was long before the current political scene. She wrote, "Turns out the koan tradition was born at a similarly urgent moment in Chinese history." So she starts out setting the stage historically, and then quotes the famous two-line verse from Du Fu. "The nation is destroyed. Mountains and valleys remain." And then the essay segues to Baso and Sekito. She writes, "Some Chan practitioners saw what Du Fu saw from their own perspective. All this ruin, all this despair." And she goes on, "In our world, things are always getting broken and mended and broken again. And there is also something that never breaks. Everything rises and falls, and yet in exactly the same moment, things are eternal and go nowhere at all. How do we see with a kind of binocular vision, one eye aware of how things are coming and going all the time, the other aware of how they've never moved at all? How do we experience this not as two separate ways of seeing, but as one seamless field of vision? This field." Sutherland writes that Mazu and Shitou pushed these questions further. They asked, this is her language, "What does it mean for each of us to be wholeheartedly part of this world? How do we fall willingly into the frightened, blasted, beautiful, tender world just as it is?" It's an artful way of framing the question we ask, even while sitting silently on our cushions. Falling into now. No floor, no boundary, and everything included. This one falling. Sutherland writes, "There's something moving about the large and generous spirit of these two men who responded to the devastation around them by saying, 'This is all me. This is all you.' They showed that the way to come to terms with life's pains is not by turning away from them, but by moving deeper into life." Yesterday, sometime sort of in the morning, I gave tonight's talk a title, spurred on by an email from Abby, "Could you please?" So the title, "What Meets the Eye?" And I wrote a short blurb for the website, more like an overture than a summary, since the talk had yet to be written. With Sekito and Baso in mind, two teachings came up, resonant with each other and, I feel, with our practice. First, when asked, "What is the essential meaning of Chan, of Zen?" Baso answers, "What is the meaning of this moment?" And Sekito taught, "What meets the eye is the way." What meets the eye is the way. Wherever you turn. So, what is essential about this moment? What is this? What if whatever comes up is the way? All of it. One, all. I would say including, of course, despair. Sekito is said to have come to a great awakening while reading a line from a commentary on the sutras. Just happened to be reading this. The line is, "The one who realizes that the myriad things are one's own self is no different from the sages." And then he went on to write this famous verse, the Sandokai, identity of relative and absolute, it's translated, which includes the line in the very first stanza, "In the way, there are no northern or southern ancestors. Just one. What meets the eye is the way." Another time, Baso was asked about the essence of his school, and his response, "It's just the place where you let go of your body and your life." About this teaching, Sutherland writes, "That was quite a statement during a time when everyone knew people who had lost both." Let go of body and life. What do we imagine we're hanging on to? Awaken now. There's no other time. So how then to allow that possibility? Sutherland offers this. She writes, "We spend a lot of time in the company of our thoughts and feelings, and sometimes we are a companion to silence. Even a hermit sits in a web of connections with things visible and invisible. Our meditation is made not just of the vastness and the deep engine of concentration. It's also made of these relationships, these 10,000 myriad things, all this support going on all the time." She goes on, "And then one day, for no apparent reason, something in particular comes to fetch us. The cook coughs, or the morning star rises, and we fall open. A particular intimate meeting with a particular other opens us to an intimate relationship with life itself." I often say that this was Dogen's definition, one of them, for awakening. Intimacy with all things. That is our birthright. So just a few more pointers from the record of Sekito's teaching. Addressing his monks, Shitou said, "Buddha mind, all beings, wisdom, and defilement. The names of these things are different, but actually they are one body. You should each recognize your miraculous mind. Its essence is apart from temporary or everlasting. Its nature is without pollution or purity. It is clear and perfect. Common people and sages are the same. No northern or southern. This mind reaches everywhere without limit, he says. It's not constrained by the limits of consciousness. If you can comprehend this, then there is nothing that you lack. I'm not sure comprehend is actually the best word. Of course, it's translation of a translation. Experience it. Sekito was fond of questioning everything, dismantling any assumption. His way came to be called silent illumination, also known as the method of no method. Just this moment to moment wakefulness. Just here. Just sitting. Just. Baso's style was different. Direct, uncompromising, sometimes startling, a shout, a whack, a strong tweak of the nose. He also taught that the treasure we seek is already ours, not something to gain or attain, but simply what you are. Ordinary mind is the way, said Baso. Mind is Buddha. This place is itself true thusness. And then no mind, no Buddha. Is there a difference? Toward the end of her essay, Settleton writes, every moment, every circumstance is another chance to experience things as they are, rather than as we wish or fear them to be. And just a bit on down, she writes, put down your despair and your hope. Begin from no position at all, and look for what becomes possible when you do. No position at all. No ground to stand on. No purchase outside of anything. Practicing together. Practicing in the midst. Thank you all for this shared practice.